We interrupt the city's regular rhythm with a bulletin from the shadows. Overnight, the New York underworld has been shaken, and one of its loudest kings is going quiet. Late last night, October 23rd, 1935, gunfire tore through a Newark chop house where Dutch Schultz sat with his men. When the smoke cleared, Schultz and 3 of his top associates were down. Not a robbery, not a brawl, but a message delivered at point-blank range. Schultz was rushed to a Newark hospital under heavy guard, and by the morning of October 24th, 1935, reports indicate the beer baron has died from his wounds, ending a reign built on fear, cash, and a refusal to live by anyone's rules but his own. But the real question isn't how he died. It's why the men who usually profit from keeping bosses alive decided Schultz had to go now, and the answer circles one name like a vulture over a courthouse roof: Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey. Dewey was under pressure the old tricks couldn't soften, investigations that climbed upward toward bosses, books, and men who thought they were untouchable. Schultz didn't just fear that pressure, he wanted to smash it. And inside the underworld, that impulse is poison. When one boss panics, everyone bleeds. And here is where the bulletin becomes a warning. Schultz didn't keep his hands downtown. He reached uptown. He pressed into Harlem. He leaned toward the numbers trade, the quiet economy moving through pockets, and backrooms like blood through veins. So the question isn't just who ordered the Newark gunfire. It's who comes to collect next.
On this rain-soaked morning, October 24th, 1935, Harlem doesn't react with surprise so much as calculation. The streets keep moving, the doors keep opening. Music still leaks from behind curtains. But under the ordinary rhythm, something has shifted, because when a collector disappears, the first thing people feel isn't relief. It's uncertainty. In Harlem, uncertainty has a price. The numbers game doesn't pause for headlines, the slips still get written, the runners still move, the policy banks still count small bills in back rooms that smell like ink and sweat, and when the system keeps running, the only question that matters is who steps in to claim the cut. Not who fired the shots, not who fell, who inherits the pressure. Because Harlem's money is quiet money, steady money, money that doesn't need a suitcase to matter. It pays rent, it buys protection. It keeps the lights on, and that makes it irresistible to outsiders who prefer tribute to warfare. So attention drifts toward a place that never appears in the papers. A back room below a club off Lenox, where the lights stay low and the doorway is watched like it's guarding a vault. In that room, an Italian emissary speaks softly in the language of the Syndicate, careful and controlled, like a man sent to prevent problems before they become headlines. Across from him sits Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, Harlem's broker, Harlem's enforcer, Harlem's survival instinct in a tailored suit. What happens next is not a takeover. It's a negotiation, a secret arrangement that shouldn't exist, a deal that breaks the underworld's unwritten rules and the era's rigid racial lines at the same time. Because if Harlem fights, Harlem burns, and if Harlem burns, everyone notices. And right now, nobody can afford to be noticed. Dutch Schultz didn't rise by being subtle. He rose by being unavoidable. He was the kind of boss who didn't just want a percentage, he wanted control, and he wanted it fast. His power came from money, violence, and a reputation for pushing situations past the point where anyone else would stop. If a rival negotiated, Schultz escalated. If a neighborhood resisted, Schultz squeezed. If a problem grew complicated, Schultz made it simple again with fear. That personality trait, aggressive, impatient, and uncontrollable, was exactly what made him dangerous to the people who were supposed to be on his side. Organized crime can survive scandal. It can survive a few arrests. It can even survive a shooting war. What it can't survive is a leader who forces everyone else into the spotlight at the worst possible moment. In 1935, the spotlight had a name: Special Prosecutor Thomas Dewey. Dewey represented the newer kind of law enforcement pressure that wasn't satisfied with rounding up street soldiers. It climbed, it traced connections, it followed money, it aimed upward toward bosses and the systems that protected them. And for the criminal leadership trying to keep business steady, Dewey wasn't just a threat. He was a clock counting down. Schultz responded to that clock in the most reckless way possible. According to underworld intelligence, he wanted to eliminate the pressure at the source by targeting Dewey himself. That was the red line. Not because criminals suddenly develop morality, but because the consequences were obvious to anyone who understood power. Strike a prosecutor and you don't reduce attention, you multiply it. You turn a courtroom problem into a political crusade. You invite a wave of raids, indictments, and public outrage that can drown every racket in the city. That is why the Mafia Commission made the decision that shocked even hardened men. Stop the plan by removing Schultz. When the commission learned of Schultz's intention to go after Dewey, it ordered Schultz's death instead, choosing internal execution over a public war with law enforcement. If you want the logic in the cleanest possible form, picture it as a simple chain, the kind you could put on screen as a flowchart. Dewey creates pressure, the commission fears the backlash of a direct strike, the order is issued, a hit team is sent, and the moment that chain completes, every other question begins. On the night of October 23rd, 1935, Schultz and 3 associates were gunned down in a Newark tavern. Schultz was rushed to a Newark hospital under heavy guard, wounded, still fighting the idea of dying, but by the next day, October 24th, he was gone. Schultz's death did something the law could not do quickly. It removed him. But it also did something the law never stops doing. It created a vacuum. And that vacuum mattered most in the places where cash moved quietly every day, outside the view of headlines. That is why Harlem becomes the center of the story. Schultz had already pushed into Harlem's lucrative rackets. He had already leaned into the numbers economy. He had already tried to make Harlem pay him like everyone else. So when he fell, the question wasn't whether Harlem would be left alone. The question was who would replace him and whether Harlem would be conquered in the open or managed in the shadows. To understand why Harlem mattered so much in 1935, you have to understand what the numbers game really was. On paper, it was an illegal lottery. In practice, it was an entire neighborhood economy, cash-based, fast-moving, woven into daily life. In the 30s, Harlem's black community was dominated by the numbers game and the protection rackets built around it. Those weren't side hustles. They were infrastructure. The system worked because it was everywhere and because it was intimate. Bets were small, the hope was big, the money moved in coins and folded bills, in slips written quickly and tucked away just as fast. Runners carried wagers. Policy banks counted the totals. Collectors enforced debts and protected territory. And through it all, the numbers game did something the formal economy often refused to do. It met people where they were. That doesn't make it noble, it makes it real. A handful of local operators controlled that reality, and the most famous of them was Stephanie Street Claire, the self-styled Queen of Harlem, Street. Claire wasn't just a name, she was an institution, one of the sharpest organizers in Harlem's underworld, known for guarding her interests with discipline and ferocity. And beside her rose a lieutenant who would become the neighborhood's hard edge, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy's early reputation came from toughness, but his importance came from function. He became Street Claire's main enforcer. He was the man you sent when persuasion failed, the man you relied on when the street demanded a response. And when Dutch Schultz started pushing into Harlem after Prohibition ended, Bumpy wasn't watching history happen, he was at the forefront of resisting it. Schultz's encroachment triggered what amounted to a turf war, even when it wasn't called that out loud. Many white-run policy banks folded under Schultz's pressure, but Street Claire and Bumpy didn't. They stood their ground and fought Schultz's crew in a series of gun battles that became, in Harlem memory, less about criminal profit and more about neighborhood autonomy, Harlem refusing to be treated like someone else's cash drawer. By late of this year, Bumpy was a known figure in Harlem, feared as a gangster, but also admired by many residents for defending the community's control over its own money. That dual status matters. It meant Bumpy wasn't just muscle, he was legitimacy, Harlem style, the kind that comes from protecting locals against outsiders, even if the protection is paid for and enforced by violence. And Harlem had a geography to this power. Lenox Avenue was the beating heart, running up through the neighborhood past clubs, speakeasies, churches, restaurants, and policy banks. In the mid-30s, later accounts would describe Bumpy as the de facto crime boss of Harlem, The man whose approval mattered if you wanted to operate a black-owned numbers game or a protection racket on Lennox. In other words, you could run your business, but you ran it under his shadow. So when Schultz died, Harlem didn't just lose an enemy. Harlem lost a predictable enemy. And that's often worse, because predictability is a form of safety in the underworld. With Schultz gone, Harlem's non-Italian racketeers faced a new challenge. The Italian-dominated bosses moving to claim Schultz's spoils, including the Harlem action he'd fought to control. That is the pressure point. Harlem wants its money local. Harlem wants its power local. But Harlem sits inside a city where outside organizations have deeper networks, more soldiers, and more ways to punish disobedience. And at the center of that collision between Harlem's autonomy and the Syndicate's expansion stands Bumpy Johnson, no longer just an enforcer, but the man who will have to decide what survival looks like when the collectors change. By the time the story reached the wider city, it was already over. The hit didn't happen in a bright place or in a dramatic place. It happened late at night in a Newark tavern, the kind of room where the air stays thick, where men sit close, where a back table can feel like a private office if the right people are watching the door. Dutch Schultz was there with his inner circle, not alone, not careless. He had men with him, bodyguards whose job was to make violence think twice before entering the room. And that is what made the attack so significant. This wasn't a random strike. It wasn't a street robbery gone wrong. This was a professional answer to a problem that had been discussed elsewhere. The gunmen came in fast. They didn't argue. They didn't threaten. They didn't posture. They opened fire until the room belonged to shock and smoke and bodies collapsing in ways that don't look real until you're the one staring at them. Schultz went down. So did 3 of his men. And in a world that survives on rumor, the most terrifying part was how quickly the rumor became a certainty. Somebody powerful had decided Schultz was no longer allowed to live. In the hours that followed, the aftermath moved like a chain reaction. Schultz, still alive for a time, was rushed under guard, bleeding and furious, clinging to life the way he had clung to control by refusing to let go. But by the morning of October 24th, 1935, the reports hardened into a final line. The beer baron was dead. And then came the real silence. Because the underworld doesn't mourn in public. It doesn't announce its intentions. It listens. It watches. It calculates. Fear spread first. Fear among Schultz's enemies, because his death meant a new power was taking the wheel, and fear among his former partners, because anyone close to a fallen boss wonders what else might be cleaned up. Opportunism followed right behind it, as smaller crews began to imagine new territory, and bigger bosses began to imagine new revenue. And above it all, a single question rose, sharp and immediate. If Schultz can be erased overnight, who is next to be rearranged? When Dutch Schultz died, the city didn't become safer. It became quieter in one specific way. The chaos had been removed from the top of one operation. And in organized crime, removing chaos is not an ending. It's a signal that management has changed. This is where the name Lucky Luciano matters, not as a myth, but as a method. Luciano's power wasn't built on being the loudest man in the room. It was built on building a system where loud men could be used or eliminated without the whole structure collapsing. He represented the newer, more corporate style of organized crime. Alliances, commissions, rules, stability, and profit that didn't require constant war. Schultz had been the opposite. Schultz was volatility with a bankroll. And once the commission decided that volatility threatened everyone, especially with a high-profile prosecutor like Thomas Dewey tightening the net, Schultz became an internal problem to be solved, not an external enemy to be feared. His death, then, wasn't just a murder. It was a reorganization, and reorganizations come with takeovers. Schultz controlled rackets. He controlled collections. He controlled pipelines of cash that ran through the city like hidden wiring. When he fell, those pipelines didn't stop carrying money. They simply became available. The practical question for the Italian syndicate was immediate. Do you let those revenue streams fracture into street wars, or do you absorb them fast enough that the streets never get the chance? That absorption wasn't only about downtown operations. It reached into Harlem. Because Schultz had already pushed into Harlem's rackets, already tried to force Harlem's numbers world to pay him like any other territory. That means Harlem wasn't watching a distant event. Harlem was watching a transfer of pressure. And that transfer created a decision point for the Italian leadership. Option 1 was conquest. Crush Harlem's independent operators, replace local control with outside crews, and enforce obedience through raw force. That approach had a certain brutal simplicity. It also had a cost. Violence attracts attention. Attention invites law enforcement. And law enforcement, especially under the public momentum of a figure like Dewey, was exactly what the commission was trying to avoid. Option 2 was taxation. Let Harlem's local structure remain in place, but skim profit from it in an organized, predictable way. This wasn't charity. It was a strategy. It meant less blood in the streets, fewer headlines, and steady income. It also meant something that would have sounded impossible to many people in 1935. An Italian syndicate treating a black Harlem power broker as a negotiating partner rather than a target. That is the surprising path the system prefers when it's thinking clearly, negotiation instead of war. Because from a business perspective, Harlem doesn't need to be flattened to be profitable. It needs to be disciplined. It needs to be predictable. And if a local figure can deliver that predictability, if he can keep the neighborhood's operators paying on time, keep outsiders from freelancing, keep disputes from turning into public chaos, then he becomes valuable. This is where Bumpy Johnson stops being just a feared name and becomes a structural answer. Harlem needed someone who could speak the language of the street and still understand the language of tribute. Someone who could keep Harlem from splintering under pressure and keep the Italians from storming in with open warfare. Someone who could make a deal stick. That is why, after Schultz falls, the question of Harlem becomes a boardroom question, even if it's asked in backrooms. Not who is toughest, but who can deliver the neighborhood without lighting a match. And so the shift begins, quietly, efficiently, through emissaries, through meetings that never enter the papers, through understandings that don't require signatures to be enforced. Schultz's era was a storm, loud, personal, unpredictable. The new era is supposed to be whether you can plan around. And Harlem, full of cash, pride, and its own power structure, is the first test of whether that new policy will be imposed with gunfire or purchased with a deal. In Harlem, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson is not just a name. He is a warning. He is a story people tell with their voices lowered. And he is, to many, something else at the same time. A defender of local control in a city that rarely allows it. By 1935, Bumpy's reputation carried two truths that don't usually live together. The first is fear. If you're a rival operator, a reckless collector, or an outsider who thinks Harlem is easy money, you learn quickly that Bumpy's presence changes the temperature of a room. The second is admiration. Some residents don't praise the crime, they praise the idea that someone is standing between Harlem's money and the downtown machine that wants to drain it. That's the identity Schultz's pressure helped forge. And now, Schultz is gone. Which means the pressure doesn't disappear. It changes shape. The practical reality is simple. Open war with the mafia is suicidal. Harlem has courage, Harlem has guns, Harlem has men who will fight. But the Italian Syndicate has something bigger than courage. Scale, networks, allies. A structure designed to survive shootings, arrests, betrayals, and leadership changes without collapsing. A neighborhood can resist. A syndicate can replace. And that difference matters when you're deciding whether to start a conflict you cannot finish. Bumpy understands that. He also understands the trap in the other direction. If Harlem bends too far, it becomes a colony. The numbers game becomes a tribute. The policy banks become branch offices. The local bosses become managers working for someone else's profit. Harlem keeps the risk and loses the reward. So Bumpy stands at a crossroads that looks like two roads, but is really one question. Do you fight for autonomy with violence, or do you bargain for it with leverage? And the stakes are personal. If Bumpy chooses war, he becomes a symbol, brief, bloody, and likely erased. If he chooses a deal, he becomes something new. Not just enforcers, not just defenders, broker, the man who can translate Harlem into terms the syndicate respects, profit, stability, discipline, and translate syndicate pressure into rules Harlem can survive under. Harlem's reaction is split down the middle, even among people standing on the same block. Pride tells the neighborhood to refuse. Pride says Harlem shouldn't kneel to anyone. Pride remembers every time the city treated the community as disposable and every time outsiders arrive with demands. But suspicion whispers a different fear, that any deal is just surrender with paperwork, that a piece bought today becomes a chain tomorrow, that tribute is still a tribute, no matter who collects it. Bumpy feels both forces pushing at him, pride and suspicion, and neither of them pay the bills if a war starts. Because the numbers economy doesn't run on speeches, it runs on routine. And routine is exactly what a syndicate is designed to control. So the decision isn't made in public. It can't be. It's made where power actually speaks. Behind closed doors, over ledgers, inside rooms where the air is heavy and the future is negotiated in percentages. On one road, Harlem fights and becomes a headline. On the other, Harlem pays and remains a rumor. And in 1935, rumor is often the safer option because the commission doesn't fear bullets as much as it fears attention. That is why, when Schultz falls, Bumpy doesn't rush to celebrate. He prepares to choose, and his choice will decide whether Harlem is conquered in the open or absorbed in silence. The exact terms of what happened next were never filed in a courthouse drawer or typed into an official ledger. Deals like this rarely are. But across historical accounts and underworld logic, the general shape converges. Schultz's removal created a transfer of control, and Harlem's survival required a negotiation with the new management. The setting fits the era and the necessity. A backroom below a club off Lenox Avenue, a guarded doorway, quiet voices, no unnecessary faces. The kind of place where people don't look at you twice, because looking is how you get remembered. It is important to understand one thing at the start. This wasn't a meeting held because anyone suddenly felt progressive. It was held because money makes its own politics. Profit has always been more flexible than prejudice, especially when violence is bad for business. From the Syndicate's perspective, Schultz's death solved one problem and exposed another. Harlem was lucrative, but Harlem was also volatile. Try to crush it outright, and you risk street wars, headlines, and the kind of law enforcement pressure the commission was trying to avoid. Try to ignore it, and you leave money on the table, and money left on the table invites freelancing, which invites chaos. So the question becomes, can Harlem be controlled without being invaded? That question arrives in the room wearing an Italian suit, but it speaks the language of a corporation. Stability, tribute, control without headlines. Luciano's interest, whether through direct intent or through the broader commission policy he represented, wasn't romance or revenge. It was structure. Schultz's rackets needed to be folded into a system that could be managed. The numbers economy in Harlem needed to remain productive without becoming explosive. And for that to happen, someone local had to carry the burden of enforcement. A syndicate can collect, but a syndicate prefers not to chase every corner personally. It prefers a gatekeeper. That is where Bumpy Johnson becomes more than a street figure. He becomes a proposal. What does the syndicate want from Bumpy? 3 things. First, a reliable flow of money, tribute that arrives on time. Second, discipline. No public chaos, no unnecessary shootings, no drama that gives the newspapers a story. Third, control by proxy. The syndicate doesn't need to sit on every Harlem corner if the corner already answers to someone who understands consequences. And what does Bumpy want in return? Not friendship, not equality. He wants local control, survival, and legitimacy inside the underworld's hierarchy. The kind of legitimacy that stops outsiders from treating Harlem like an open buffet. He wants Harlem's day-to-day operations to remain Harlem's. He wants the runners, bankers, and policy shops to keep working under a familiar system instead of being replaced by foreign crews. He wants to protect the local economy, illegal as it may be, because it pays too many people to be sacrificed. And most of all, he wants a line drawn in ink that guns can respect. This is Harlem's house, and the syndicate collects at the door, not from the kitchen. The impossible element is not simply the deal. It's the quiet crossing of a racial barrier that both the legitimate world and the criminal world pretended was unbreakable. Publicly, the era insists on separation. Privately, the underworld has always made exceptions when profit demands it. In the room, that contradiction doesn't get discussed as philosophy. it gets handled like a business detail. Unspoken, practical, and dangerous if revealed. Because if word spreads that Syndicate leadership is negotiating with a Black Harlem power broker as a partner, it threatens reputations, alliances, and the fragile social rules that keep certain men comfortable. So the meeting stays small, the language stays careful, the understanding stays deniable. This is why the deal makes strategic sense. It's not a takeover, it's a tax system. Harlem continues to function, but it pays. The Syndicate gains revenue without warfare. Bumpy gains protection through recognition, because once a deal exists, outsiders who violate it aren't just disrespecting Harlem. They're disrespecting the larger machine behind Harlem. The negotiation would have turned on leverage. Bumpy's leverage is that Harlem can be expensive to conquer. Harlem can become noisy. Harlem can become a problem that invites politicians and prosecutors to start asking questions no one wants asked. If the Syndicate wants quiet profit, it needs a quiet Harlem. The Syndicate's leverage is obvious. Reach, force. The ability to punish anyone who mistakes local pride for immunity. The ability to replace chaos with discipline if Harlem refuses discipline voluntarily. And somewhere between those two pressures, the agreement takes shape. Not with a signature, with an understanding. A tribute arrangement, a recognition of territory, a promise of restraint, a warning that the deal is peace, and peace is conditional. By the end of that day, whispers hardened into a street-level truth. A truce has been reported, not in the newspapers, not in any official statement, but in the way collectors change their routes, in the way operators stop looking over their shoulders for an immediate invasion, in the way Harlem's machine keeps running, only now with a new hand quietly taking a percentage off the top. Whether the handshake was literal or symbolic doesn't matter. What matters is what it represents. Harlem's future changes without a parade, without a public announcement, without a single headline explaining the real shift. Because in 1935, the most important transfer of power isn't the one announced with gunfire. It's the one finalized in a back room, when everyone agrees to stop shooting, start collecting, and pretend nothing changed at all. Once the shock settled and the smoke cleared, the deal only mattered if it could be understood in plain terms and enforced in the real world. No speeches, no signatures, just rules that everyone could feel. The agreement, as is generally understood across historical accounts, can be broken down into a few concrete realities. First, tribute. A regular cut flowed upward. Not a one-time payment, not a favor, but a system. Money leaving Harlem on a schedule. That schedule was the whole point. It transformed a violent question into a predictable income stream. Second, local control. Harlem's operators kept the day-to-day running of the numbers game and related rackets. The runners still ran. The policy banks still counted. The neighborhood's machine stayed familiar on the surface. That wasn't generosity, it was efficiency. Outsiders didn't need to learn every corner if someone local was already keeping the engine running. Third, mutual protection. The Italians deterred outside interference. That meant fewer freelancing crews trying to muscle in, fewer random invasions from rivals who assumed Harlem was unclaimed after Schultz's death. In return, Bumpy kept the local side disciplined. He made sure the tribute arrived. He kept disputes from turning into public chaos. He made the neighborhood behave like a territory under management, not a battlefield. Fourth, profit sharing without warfare. This was the central business logic. The Syndicate gained steady income without the cost of an open takeover, no prolonged gun battles, no daily headlines, no pressure that invited prosecutors to make careers off the violence. Harlem, meanwhile, avoided being flattened. Autonomy survived, but it survived inside a tax system. If you want to picture the structure, think of it as a simple flow of money and authority. Harlem's daily cash is collected locally, consolidated through Bumpy's control, and then a portion moves upward into the wider Luciano-connected network. The operators keep operating, the Syndicate keeps earning, and enforcement becomes less about dramatic punishment and more about the quiet certainty that missing payments has consequences. Because that's the part people forget. A deal in the underworld isn't peace, it's an order. And order is only real when everyone believes the penalties are real. Above the numbers, slips, above the backroom meetings, Harlem still had a spotlight. That is what made it different from other territories. Harlem wasn't just a place where money moved. It was a place where America watched. The Cotton Club stood as the most famous symbol of that contradiction. Glamour on the outside, segregation at the door. A room filled with celebrities, wealthy patrons, and underworld money, where black performers created the sound of the age while being kept separate from the audience that came to consume it. It was a nightlife spectacle, and it was also a reminder that power could dress itself in tuxedos and still operate like a racket. That is, the surface. Underneath, the neighborhood ran on a different spine, Lenox Avenue. Lenox wasn't just a street, it was an artery. Clubs and theaters and storefront churches, barbershops and restaurants, corners where people gathered, watched, and listened. And tucked among them, policy banks and quiet offices where the numbers economy was managed like any other business, just one that had to remain invisible to the wrong kind of attention. At night, Harlem performed, music out front, laughter in the open, marquee lights, promising joy. But the business that mattered happened behind curtains and inside back rooms, where respect was counted in cash and stability was worth more than pride. The same neighborhood that could produce elegance on stage could also produce discipline in silence, because discipline is what kept the money flowing and the outsiders negotiating instead of invading. That is the true atmosphere of 1935 Harlem, a place where culture and crime weren't separate worlds. They were parallel tracks. One made the neighborhood famous. The other kept it financed and fought over. And when a deal is cut in Harlem, it doesn't stop the music. It changes who owns the night. In the immediate aftermath, the most visible change wasn't a parade or a public announcement. It was the absence of open warfare. Harlem didn't erupt the way it could have. The numbers economy kept running. The collectors kept collecting. The neighborhood stayed recognizable. But inside that continuity, a new reality hardened. Bumpy Johnson rose. Not just in reputation, but in function. He moved from being an enforcer, someone who carried out decisions, to being a middleman who helped shape them. He became the man who could speak Harlem's language to the Syndicate and the Syndicate's language back to Harlem. That shift is power. It's the difference between having influence and having a seat at the table where territory is divided. Harlem's autonomy, in a sense, survived. Local operators weren't wiped out overnight. The neighborhood wasn't simply replaced by outside crews. But that survival came with a cost. Harlem lived under a tax system. Tribute flowed upward. Control remained local, but permission now had a shadow behind it. And that is the underworld lesson that this year makes clear. Violence makes headlines. Deals make empires. Schultz's death was the loud part. The part that newspapers could print, the part police could point to, the part the city could pretend was the whole story. But the real transfer of power happened quietly afterward, when the money routes were reassigned and the rules were rewritten without ink. So if you remember one line from this year, remember this. 1935 wasn't just a hit, it was a transfer of power. And as the decade moves forward, that transfer ripples outward through Dewey's rising crusade, through shifting alliances downtown, and through Harlem itself, where the music stays loud, the deals stay quiet, and the future is always being negotiated just out of sight.